Okay, so welcome back. We're at lesson 3 of the Jewish value of giving. Um, I put the handout in the Zoom chat, but it's also going to be in the YouTube description as a link. The topic of this week is how to give or how much to give. Um, Basically, the big question we're asking today is how does Judaism define generosity and where does it place limits, if any? So the first, if you're going to do a trivia question and ask somebody, how much does Judaism expect you to give? Well, 10%, right? So is that true? Well, somewhat. But let's first explore the sources on this. So we know that the earliest source of anyone tithing is Avram Avinu, Abraham. It says that he met Malki Tzedek, who brought him lechem vayayin. He brought him wine and bread, and he was a priest to the one on high. And Avram gave him uh, a tithe, 10% maaser from everything he had. Fast forward a couple of generations to Yaakov Avinu, on his way to Haran to visit his uncle Lavan. He's running away from his brother Esav. He goes to sleep on the mountain and he has a whole dream with the ladder going up and the angels going up, going down. And he makes a promise to God saying, "Listen, if you're nice to me, I'm paraphrasing, then I'll give you 10% of everything." Now, that's sort of historically um, where we see the first concept of giving maser, of giving 10% of one's earnings. Now, in terms of the biblical commandment, we see this in Deuteronomy in chapter 14, verse 22. It's actually one of your sources here. As it said, we actually quoted this same pasuk last week. We talked about the aser to aser, that by tithing you become wealthy. But what does it actually say there? It says, "You shall tithe all the crop that the field gives forth year by year." Aser to aser is called to asarecha, hayotze asada shana shana. So every year you have to give 10% of your earnings, of your crops. Um, this applies to both agriculture as well as livestock. That every year you have to give 10% of your livestock that were born that year uh, to um, to the temple or to charities, whatnot. Now, this is something that, of course, is established for all generations. And primarily, as I mentioned, the obligation, biblically speaking, is to give from your farms, whether that's agriculture or livestock. The Torah specifically says you have to give 10%. Now, obviously, nowadays we don't have most of our income coming from these two sources, at least just culturally. That's not the way most Jews make a living. Um, Not that there's anything wrong with that, but just that's a reality we live in. And the custom became that there's a tradition of donating at least at the very minimum 10% of what our income is to the needy or to Torah institutions or mitzvah causes, any sort of charity. Charity is kind of a broad term. When we talk about tzedakah, we're not just saying literally going to somebody who's poor and giving them money. Although, of course, that is definitely tzedakah, but it really stretches across a broad range of things, whether that's supporting Jewish education or any sort of mitzvah cause. Um, it's really, Judaism is very liberal in its interpretation of what classifies as a tzedakah. Um, And so for thousands of years, Jews have been giving maaser, a tenth of their earnings, even if they're not making it from livestock or agriculture, to charity. And the, there is actually a custom to try to give two-tenths, meaning a fifth of one's earnings. But where do we before we go to the greater amount? Let's see how we learn. And here we have a Tosfot from the Gemara in Tanis here in text 2. Larry, do you want to read this one? You up for it?
Sure. Let me, it's in the document you sent, right?
Yeah,
The
page
link?
2, where it says
Okay.
the number 2, the second
Good.
source over here. Tosfot
Uh,
9a.
Tosafot, yes, yes, yes. 9A. How can we infer that it applies not only to grain, but also to interest, business gains, and all other forms of profit? Because the verse says, you shall tithe all the crop, when it could have plainly said, you shall tithe the crop. This superfluous and more inclusive word teaches us to tithe the interest, business gains, and all other profits.
Okay, thank you. So what we're saying here is a common theme that is applied in studying the Torah is realizing that the Torah does not take any word for granted. And any word that's in the Torah, if it could have been avoided, it will be avoided. And if a word is there, it's there to teach us something specific. So if it just said, Aser ta'aser et tuvuat zarecha, that you shall surely tithe the crops of your field, then we'd understand a tithe means 10% of your crops. And nobody's going to think that, oh, well, it's just 10% of 30% of your crops, so just 3%. No. Tithing your crops means all your crops. Why does it have to say all your crops? That word all, kol in Hebrew, is to include all forms of profit. However it is, whether it's coming from what then was the norm, which is agriculture, or whether it's interest, whether it's a salary, whatever it might be that is your form of income, that needs to be tithed as well. So that's where we see the Gemara learns from the Torah that we have to tithe all sorts of property. Now, later on in the Jerusalem Talmud relates that the sages of Usha in, enacted. Let me read it over here in source number 3. This is from Tractate Ketubot. The Jerusalem Talmud states that the sages enacted at Usha that Jews ought to dispense a fifth of their income for the mitzvah. The basis of this seems to be the Torah's obligation that the Jewish farmer give 2 annual tithes. The first tithe went to a Levite, and depending on the year, the second tithe was given either to the poor or brought to Jerusalem to be enjoyed there by the owner who would also share it with others. So there's actually, I'm not going to go into this, the whole chain of 24 different priestly gifts, but there really is a whole series of gifts in Judaism that we have to give away, whether that's, for example, giving the firstborn animal to a Kohen, or giving the corners of your fields. And there's a lot of different laws that apply to livestock and animals, etc. But some of those basic ones is, first of all, that you give 10% to the Levite off the top. Then there's also, you have to give approximately 2% to a Kohen. And then there's another tithe. It's called a Meiser Sheni, which which is not something that you necessarily give away, but you have to consecrate it. You have to set it aside for your next trip to home base, to Jerusalem, whether that's one of the holidays or just, I don't know, you're going there for your cousin's wedding and you happen to be in Jerusalem. So you take your set aside second tithe and you eat it in Jerusalem. So if you're talking about actual, let's say, oranges, So you set it aside for a month, and oranges could last for a month. And next time you go up to Jerusalem, you eat your oranges within the geography, within the geographical space of Jerusalem. Or if it's something that's not going to last, you could convert it to money. So let's say you have $100 worth of oranges and you gave 10% away already to the Levite. And now you need to set aside another 10%, so another $10 worth of oranges. So you sell those oranges, put the $10 aside, and next time you go to Jerusalem, you support the Jerusalem economy with those $10. And you buy yourself a pizza or a falafel, and you make sure to eat that pizza or falafel in Jerusalem. That's how it was done in temple times. So this idea of giving a fifth has its basis in that you have to give 1/10 to the Levite, and then another tenth, which is called Meiser Sheni, the second tithe, which you're not necessarily giving away, but it has to be eaten in Jerusalem. But actually, there was a whole cycle um, with every sabbatical year cycle. So you have 7 years. 6 years you work, 1 year you don't work the field, right? So the first 2 years of the 7 year cycle, you would eat your own produce in Jerusalem, called Meiser Sheni. The third year, you would have to give Meiser to the poor, Meiser Ani. The fourth and fifth year was Meiser Sheni, where you'd eat it yourself in Jerusalem. And the sixth year, again, you'd give the Meiser to the poor. So it's 2 and 1, 2 and 1. That's kind of the sequence, how that would work. So however you look at it, all 6 of those years, there was a fifth of one's agricultural property that was being given away or consecrated in one form or another off the top. And so that's where this practice came in Usha, that people should dispense a fifth of their earnings to charity. Now, this isn't necessarily actually binding law. In fact, in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law by Rabbi Yosef Karo, and with the glosses of the Ashkenazi Rabbi Moshe Isserles, they actually clarify and they say that if you can afford it, there's actually three categories. So level number, let's call it level number 3, the highest level, is, as it says in the Torah, pasoach tiftach. You should surely open your hand to the poor and give him whatever he needs. So if this guy had just, he was a real estate mogul before 2008, and then he lost his entire earnings, and he used to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner on his yacht, until you give him what he's used to, you haven't fully supplied him with his needs. Okay, so I'm giving the most extreme example, but the point is, if you're a person who's able to do that for somebody else, you should give him as much as he needs, whatever it is. Level number 2, a step down from that, is to give 20% of your income, and that's based on this norm that existed during temple times. And level number 1, which is the basic accepted requirement, is to give 10% of your income, and that's the ordinary way that's the standard way of doing the mitzvah. And we learned this from Abraham and from Yaakov Avinu, who both, the Torah tells us that they gave away 10% of everything they had. And the Shulchan Aruch says that anybody who gives less than 10% is considered miserly. Now, on a practical note, the Shalah, which was a Kabbalist, his name is Rabbi Yeshayahu Halevi Horowitz, he writes that it's best for a person to designate a special place to store your tithes. And then so in practical terms, it's best to set up a charity savings account or whatever, a bank account for charity. So the moment you get your paycheck, even before you figure out where you want to give your tithe, you just immediately set aside 10%, put it in your charity account, and then the next time somebody approaches you and asks for charity, it's already set aside. So you don't. it makes it easier just psychologically on the person to be able to say, okay, this is my charity account. I'm not spending it for anything else but charitable causes, and that's what it's designated for. Now, you want to give in addition to that, that's your choice. But this way, you've already done that. You've done the mitzvah of setting it aside, and at the right time, you disperse it appropriately. Now, the question is, what if a person has his own family expenses and, he's living paycheck to paycheck and it ain't easy. So what kind of, we know in the tax code, there's all sorts of tax deductions. You could say it's a business expense, it's a this expense, an educational expense, a travel expense. How does Judaism look at that in terms of um, deductions? So generally, the accepted understanding is that family expenses cannot be deducted from your net income. Um, However, um, according to most halachic experts, when it comes to business expenses, you are allowed to deduct business expenses. So if you're running a business and say you gross $1 million a year, but 800,000 of that is paying employees and whatever other expenses that you have in running your business, and your net profit in your business is only 200,000, you only need to give 10% of the 200,000, not off the entire gross of what your business made. So it's basically the net profit minus your business expenses. Um, Now, just one last thing, and then I want to go to the chart that we have, and that is here in text 4. The Shulchan Aruch tells us, and this again from the Code of Jewish Law, that it's forbidden to turn away a tzedakah request empty-handed. Even the smallest amount is considered giving. And he quotes from Tehillim chapter 74 saying that do not let the oppressed retreat disgraced. Al Yashev Dach Ani, or something like that. Basically, um, that you can't say no if somebody asks you for charity. Now, you could give them a penny, a nickel, a dime, whatever it might. In fact, the kids, they learn in preschool, even if it's a penny, a nickel, or a dime, whatever, there's a whole song that goes with it. But just on a personal level, I'll tell you my Zaidi, my Zaida, Yoel HaKohen ben Meshulam Feivel, um, he had a practice. He was not a man of means by any stretch. Came here as an immigrant in 1950, a survivor of the Holocaust. Moved around between jobs, ran a grocery store at some point. He worked in his cousin's bakery, this and that, whatever. But as any Jewish person knows, you get requests in the mail from time to time from this organization, that organization, and without fail, my grandfather would open every letter request for tzedakah, and he would send back an envelope with a $1 bill, and he would write a note. He'd say, I want you to understand, I'm a Holocaust survivor. I don't have a lot of money, but you've asked, so I'm sending you something. And so no matter who asked, no matter what the organization was, he'd always send something back. And that's living with this halacha, which is that you're not allowed to turn away a tzedakah request empty-handed. Now, for every person, not turning away looks different. For some people, not turning away is $1. For some, it's a nickel. For some, it's $18. For some, it's $1,000. Whatever it might be. Every person on their level. But that's just some of the framework in terms of understanding that there's two elements at play. On the one hand, there's my personal finances, my personal obligation to give tzedakah, and that, of course, is based on my income and my resources. But at the same time, tzedakah is not just a hypothetical spiritual ambition that I'm trying to achieve, but there's there's actually needy people out there that have needs. So regardless of my own personal spiritual ambitions, there's a need that needs to be filled, and I cannot ignore that. and that's why I have to respond when there's a need. And yes, on the lower level, you have to give something, whatever that minimal amount might be. And on a higher level, you can say, if you have the means to give somebody more than 10 or 20% of your earnings and they're still in need and you have the ability to fill that need, then absolutely go ahead and give as much as necessary. But now I want to turn to the chart that we have here. I see you can't minimize the zoom, but let me see if I can share my screen here because I think this is very useful. Okay, let's see what happens if I go like this. View. Well, full screen. That's what I want. There we go. So here you have 8 levels in tzedakah giving. It's quoted both in Maimonides and Mishnah Torah, the laws of gifts to the poor, Hilchos Matnos Aniyim, chapter 10, and also in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, in Yoredeah, chapter 249. It's actually, have it in front of me here, chapter 249. This is laws number 6 through 13. Oh, that's easy to remember. 613. Okay, so let's see. Level number 1. And this is, by the way, this is going highest to lowest over here. So the highest level of giving tzedakah, the best way one could possibly do it is by providing a loan, a job, or partnership so that the recipient no longer needs charity. Because this is what it says in Leviticus 25. You should strengthen him from the word chazak. Give the person strength. Don't just give like the old saying. Give a man a fish, you fed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish. I don't know how that sentence ends, but you get the point. That is the highest level of charity. So it might not sound very noble and altruistic, but bottom line, it's the most practical and effective way of giving charity. Step number 2, lower than that, is that the benefactor and recipient do not know each other's identity. Um, so, for example, you donate to a pot that's being distributed to charity, and you don't know which people are on the receiving end, and similarly, the people on the receiving end don't know who contributed to that fund, so they don't get to come over to you and thank you for your kindness or give you any recognition. It's just simply blind giving. Now, the Shulchan Aruch qualifies that this type of blind giving should only be done if there's a appointee, somebody who's in charge of this fund that you trust and you know is reliable to actually disperse the funds honestly and to those who actually need it. So if you're able to do that, that would be second to ideal. The third to ideal is where the benefactor knows the recipient, but the recipient does not know. I see there's a little typo. Does not know the benefactor. So again, an example of how this was done is says that some of the sages would go by the houses of poor people and they would drop a wad of cash at their front door and run away. This is before they had video cameras, right? So you know who you're giving it to, but the recipient has no clue where this came from. It's not identifiable. There was no credit card number charged that can be traced. Nothing. It's just they receive it from God as far as they know, right? The next level, number 4, is the recipient knows the benefactor, but the benefactor does not know the recipient. This was a common practice. The Talmud tells us about that philanthropists would walk on the road facing one way, and the poor people would be behind them, and they would throw the money behind them, not in a disgraceful way, but just as a way to preserve the anonymity of the recipient. So again, it's not as ideal as level 2. Why? Because potentially you can get some recognition for it. Or at least you get the feeling now everybody in town knows that you're a big giver. But it still has the benefit of protecting the dignity of the recipient. Um, so that's why that's another level. A level beneath that is without any of these anonymous factors, just giving straightforward to a person, but doing it before they ask. In other words, having that intuition and being really in touch with the recipient and realizing what their needs are before they even ask you for anything. That is another level. Again, it doesn't have the element of anonymity, but it's still very praiseworthy. Number six is giving the correct amount upon request, which, again, for somebody to just give charity, no questions asked, and no hesitation, this is a very high level. Even though we're putting it at level six compared to the other five, but it's still a very high level to give whatever you're asked for. And level seven is giving less than what one could be giving, but with a smile. And this is often very I would say the typical type of giving is people make all sorts of calculations. You know, I need this and I want this comfort and that comfort, and I'm concerned and I have savings and retirement and who knows what. But they do it with a smile. At the end of the day, whatever they choose to give, ultimately, they do it happily, and they give, as we call it in Hebrew, b'sever panim yafes, with a smiling countenance. And of course, the lowest level is giving unhappily. But again, this is let's not discount the fact that they're giving, and the fact that they're giving is of course incredible. So the common denominator between all these things is that the giving happens. Now, how you do it, and if it's anonymous, and if you picked up on it, and how much you gave, and all that, those are details. And granted, we can work to climb this ladder, so to speak. But it starts with actually realizing that this is, as we spoke last week, this is the channel through which Hashem gives us the blessings. This is the wheels that helps the whole wagon be able to move. And Hashem should help that we should all have a lot of money, that we should be able to give a lot of money, and we should build our credit line with God, that He should see that we do good things with the money that He gives us, and He should continue to pour it in our direction multifold in many ways and in abundance, and we should be able to be good custodians and allocate them to the right places. Thank you very much for joining us. And next week, the topic of discussion is what to do when giving is hard, how Judaism responds to resistance, fear, and the feeling that we just can't. So we'll be addressing that next week, Mirz Hashem.